Okay, good morning, good morning, good morning. And we are going to look at Essential Sciences Chapter 10. We just finished the muscles, and then we're going to look at biomechanics. So this chapter brings everything together and begins the platform for assessment as well. So what I'm going to do is do this chapter, chapter 10, and then we'll do another video that will show you how to use all of the chapters together in this unit in Essential Science. So let's get started. And so here we are on our little electronic version. So we're going to click on this. And let's see. Let's get here. This is our unit 3. And we're on biomechanics. And there's a truck in the background, but the birds aren't chirping yet. So there we go. They just started. I'm beginning to think it's an actual causation here. All right. So what we're doing here is looking at function. The other 3 chapters, bones, joints, muscles, the chapters had function in it, but it was really more about the parts. And so when we think of biomechanics, it's how does everything function together to produce an outcome like walking or standing or sitting. And so this is a study or a science in and of itself. And this can feel more complex than the study of the bones and joints and muscles. Is a lot of memorization to it, a lot of repetition, a lot of recall, where now we're back to again, we have to think about this. And so this chapter for some people can feel a little overwhelming. Now, in my opinion, this is the chapter, along with chapter 11 in fundamentals of therapeutic massage. I'm going, is it chapter 1? The assessment chapter, they work together. And so you're going to want to flip back and forth between the 2 books to try to continue to relate the sciences to the application. So we're going to go through this just as an outline of the chapter, and then we'll come back in another video and look at it as a more complete thought process. So you know how you use a textbook now, and this learning how to learn will give you some ideas over and above what I just mentioned. And then we got language. We always have language, and kinesiology and biomechanics are pretty standard in terms of an understanding of the language. In other sciences, like the Science Foundation for Physical Therapy or chiropractic or whatever, but not so much in massage therapy. There's been a lot of misuse of the language, actually. So we're going to see if we can clear some of that up and talk about the importance of being able to speak a common language instead of our own unique language. So this is going to give you, this section right here is going to give you the overview of that. and what that's all about. And this is a whole study in and of itself. I mean, you can get bachelor's degrees and master's degrees in biomechanics. So we're just trying to get an overarching understanding of this. Where it does come into play for massage therapy is as we understand our own use of our own body for the body mechanics and the ergonomics discussions that we have, and the understanding of force transfer and levers and ground reaction force and all of that. So there is strong overarching influence. And again, this has kind of been ignored in the massage community as well. And hopefully that's going to change in the future. I talked about this in the Biomechanics and Ergonomics chapter, chapter 8 in Fundamentals. So here's just a reminder in a practical application of how we are going to directly use this information. And here's a little kind of a schematic. I always have to click that thing out of there. That you can use to mimic how you're setting your body up and the biomechanics principles that are involved with that. So force is an important concept. What we do when we provide massage with the methodology is we exert a mechanical force. There are other kinds of forces, but what we use is a mechanical force. And those forces cause the soft tissue to either move or change shape. And if it changes shape, it will then be exposed to what they call a stress. And if that stress becomes too exaggerated, it strains, and then there's a potential for the tissue to breach or break. And so we would see that in a ligament sprain or a muscle strain or a bone fracture, a contusion where the compressive stress becomes so much that the tissue breaks. So that's what this is right here. And there's some language that goes with it. Let me bring this up a little bit so I can see it. Okay. So if you go back and look at Fundamentals of Therapeutic Massage, we talked about how the application of massage provides these various or causes these various stresses on the tissue. So this is trying to give you some context here. So one of the principles here is that soft tissue is viscoelastic. It's a lot like silly putty and Play-Doh, and even bread dough is viscoelastic. And so if we have a massage application of gliding with moderate pressure, that results in tissue loaded with combined compressive stress, a combined force, compressive stress and tension stress. And that creates a longitudinal tensional strain, which then the outcome temporarily elongates the tissue. To what extent there's a give in that tissue. Here's another example. Massage application kneading. It's a twist with moderate drag, That's less slip, results in tissue loaded with combined compressive stress, tension stress, and shear stress. It creates a shear strain, and the outcome is there's a temporary elongation there, and there's a lifting and sliding of tissue layers. Now, these same forces, the mechanical force, these same stresses can cause injury. So here's an example. Let's look at ligaments down here as plastic. So action causing injury, landing wrong after a jump, results in tissue loaded with combined compressive stress, tension stress, and a shear stress, creates longitudinal tensional compression and shear strain with an outcome of a sprained ankle and a knee. So as we are trying to comprehend what is happening under our hands or our forearms, the language here in biomechanics is going to cross over from what we might think of as a isolated practice. It's going to give us a way of explaining a mechanism of outcome. So the following elements influence or are related to force and massage application. So pressure and inertia has to do with movement and acceleration and speed and resistance and effort. And so when we're doing massage, we have to stop and think about these as well, because we want to get the most done, for example, with the least amount of effort. Levers and fulcrums, now we're getting back to functional components, and these are joints and bones, basically, and then the force, the application to move is provided by the muscles, always through the nervous system. So every time we use a crowbar or something, we are using these simple machines. If you want to look something up, look up simple machines. And so here you may have seen this picture in fundamentals of therapeutic massage, but this is talking about a vector and a direction, and how by changing the direction and the vector, it changes the force that's introduced into the tissue. Here, there's a lot of energy wasted. We got some down, but a lot of the energy is out. Whereas if we go up a hill, is what we simply will call that. We've got the compression coming down, but we also have the force forward. So there's a combined tensional stress and a compression stress. And we also have to consider mechanical advantage too. This comes into play when we're thinking about where we're going to do potentially, we'll talk about chapter 11, and later on in this chapter, the idea of some muscle testing. And so it's going to be, if we're at the end of the lever, end of the bone, the distal end of it. So here's the joint, and here's where we apply the pressure. There's an advantage here to the person applying the pressure. But if we try to do it up closer to the joint, we lose our mechanical advantage, and the resistance is increased. So this influences hand position. We typically want to stabilize at the, if we're going to move a limb or do some joint movement or something, we stabilize at the joint, just above the joint, and then we would move down here so that we have mechanical advantage. Makes it easier for us to do that. And then this always is confusing to people. And I actually have some videos, YouTube videos that explains this, but bring the size down a little bit. Whoop. Always takes us back to these. Okay. So if we are thinking about this idea, simple machines, and the effort versus resistance and the axis of that, these are divided into first class, second class, and third class levers. So a first class lever is more like a teeter-totter. So if I were sitting here and somebody else were sitting here, this is where the joint would be, and here's where the bones would be. If there's more effort produced here, then this will rise. But if there's more resistance applied, then it will overcome the effort. Now, there aren't very many of these kinds of first-class levers in the body. And so there's some pictures later on that will show that. So here's the other kind of lever. And this is where the joint is at the end. We have a few more of these. The resistance in the middle and the effort is at the other end. And then a third class. So most of the levers in the body are third class. And they allow us to have an upright position and still have the ability to move quickly. And so, but there is some change in the strength, how much effort it allows this type of lever for us to move a load. Now, this is not, these levers, you have to have a little bit of an idea. These first class levers, second and third class, you need to have a little bit of an idea of this so that you are able to understand what you're reading, but it's not like we are going to become biomechanical experts. This is just a little bit of background. And if there were going to be a test question on it, it might be the joints of the elbow is what kind of a lever. And that would be a third class. So this little outline that we have right here, this little description gives you examples. But probably not. I don't suggest you spend a lot of time memorizing this. This is more important in terms of how we actually function. Balance, equilibrium, and stability. And we have to have stability. Our joints have to have a level of continuity. They have to be able to be firm enough so that we actually can bounce. You know, I think of standing on one foot. If we're too lax, and that can happen, there are some connective tissue diseases that cause laxity, and or it can be acquired, like with aggressive stretching over long periods of time. So if our stability becomes compromised, then we're going to have problems with balance and equilibrium. And our inner ear has a lot to do with that sense of balance and equilibrium as well. So here are some balance principles that come into play when we're looking at where somebody's performance, their ability to walk, daily living activities, and or performance demand, like a musician or a dancer or a construction worker. This is where there can be some concern if a person is having trouble in any of these areas. Now, this becomes a factor when we think about our weight transfer to apply pressure during massage. We want to move the center of gravity forward so that it is between our feet and our contact point on the client. That way we get the weight transfer. Whereas if we're doing something like with martial arts or something, we want that center of gravity fall right between our feet, because then we are more balanced. And so inherently we're a little off balance when we are providing massage. So the practical applications in through here will help you get some comprehension of these little bit more abstract concepts we're trying to describe in this chapter. So one of the things we assess is posture, and recently there's been some issues around, you know, this ideal posture and if that really makes any effect or not. I think my personal opinion is I think that initially, you know, standing upright and all that, I think that was overemphasized a little bit, but you can't go so far the other way to say that our ability to maintain a functional upright position, if that's compromised with excessive changes, like an excessively forward head or excessive low back lordosis, then that's going to increase the effort required to maintain balance and equilibrium and stability. So I do think that posture has an effect, but I don't think that we have to strive to be totally symmetrical and in that rigid upright posture. I do think that as we compare one side to the other, we're looking for a level of symmetry and movement or deviation off the norm. And the further off that is, the more biomechanical strain that would have in daily life activities. And that can result in fatigue and muscle tension problems, tone problems, and joint alignment not being just right, which can start to increase wear and tear on joints. So we have, like a pendulum swings back and forth here. We have these areas that we have to try to balance. We have to try to balance our head here, and then we've got the thorax, which is pretty stable. And then we've got this whole lumbar area that we've got to try to balance the whole upper body here at the hip. And then, you know, this is so that we can move efficiently. We've got another hinged joint at the knee and the ankle. And so, especially here at the hip, if the torso is too far forward or too far back, it's going to create strain all the way down the chain. The function of the pelvis in all of this is actually quite complex. And in general, we want to stay relatively neutral with the ability to make small adjustments to maintain the balance. So if the pelvis, which is kind of the linchpin here, is in a generalized neutral position, you can measure this, the anterior superior iliac spine. So this is where your boning landmarks come in. And the posterior superior iliac spine are level with each other in the transverse plane. And the anterior superior inferior inferior spine is at the same vertical plane as the symphysis pubis. So you can feel your symphysis pubis down in the lower very end of the abdominal area. So you don't want a tipping like this or twisting like that. Now, in the advanced classes that we have at Health Nutrition Center, we look at some indirect methods to try to level the pelvis. But just as often, this is a referral to a physical therapist, possibly a chiropractor, a physiatrist, who would couple some of the passive movements with some corrective exercise on this. So this gives you the visual landmarks that you're looking at. And when we are just trying in general, whoops, what did I do here? I went someplace I did not want to go. So let's go up. And then we went all the way up. So we were here just starting to look at postural stabilization. So let's go back to that. Okay. And that's what you do when you hit something that made you go someplace. Okay, here we are. So this is a simple version of how we can eyeball and look for functional symmetry and stability related to balance and posture. So these cross lines are areas that we would typically have movement. So starting at the feet, then we have a lot of movement in those planes, adduction, abduction in the frontal plane, flexion and extension. Down here it would be pronation, supination, and plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. That's where most of the movement happens. And then here at the knee, there's a little bit of internal and rotation, but we mostly see flexion and extension. And if we're standing on our feet, which is a closed kinematic chain, your ankles and your knees, as well as your hips up here, they have to move together as a unit. But if we're sitting down, for example, then we can move our ankles independently and our knees independently. But if we're up, walking, running, moving, there's a coordinated chain that occurs here, and there is a sequence in which the muscles will contract and relax to produce a movement. Then here at the torso, right through here, this is where we have our sacroiliac joints the pubis right in here. That pelvic bowl sits right there. This is the top of the iliac crest. This is where the spine, the lumbar spine, the sacroiliac, or the lumbar dorsal, lumbar sacral junction occurs. And there's a lot of movement here between these two areas for flexion and extension, but combined rotation is allowed, as well as lateral flexion, which is confusing, but side to side, which would be more in the frontal plane. So this then becomes a vulnerable area for where the tissues can move a little bit out of alignment, because they're a little looser here because there's more movement here. Same with the knees down here. And so if you hear people start to complain, often these are the key areas. It'll be the knees, it'll be the hips, it'll be right along the sacroiliac joints in the back, and then in the lumbar area. Now, interestingly, a lot of that can start if there's compromised mobility or lack of mobility here at the ankles, because again, this all works in concert together. Now, the rest of the thorax here is pretty stable. People will get some tension between their shoulder blades and that sort of thing, but unless there's trauma, like a car accident or something, this area in terms of posture is not that, issues are not that prevalent. What we get in here is breathing dysfunction. The bellows system of the thorax and the thoracic vertebrae and the ribs and all that, that is what's more likely to occur here. And then this is C7. This is now we've got our our cervical mobility here, and we move mostly at C6 and C7 and up at our atlas axis. And so these then become areas that are more vulnerable to the wear and tear, strain, or injury. So we can start to think about now, where are we going to concentrate massage? Because these are jointed areas. So a lot of what we would do with massage would be between these areas. So we might work with some mobility or something at the ankles, general joint movement, active and passive. But most of what we would do is try to normalize the tissue between the movement segments. So between the knee and the ankle, which will then create a better functional capacity for the joint. So then, similarly, if somebody's got hip issues, in addition to working the whole body, we might concentrate in this area right here. And then if somebody has these cervical area, maybe it's the chiropractor that's actually trying to work directly with the jointed area, but our area of expertise is working on the soft tissue in between. Okay. And then this gives you the verbiage, that I just kind of wandered around through. Now we get into actual movement. So this was our postural stability. We have to have stability before we can move. And so this is, we're seeing here getting up and down from a chair, and how all of those units now work together. So for an example here, the feet are loaded, they're on the floor, it's a closed kinetic chain, and all of the hip, the knee, and the ankle all have to work together, and the upper body has to be pretty stable in order for that to occur. And then gait. And so a lot of what our functional movement is pre-wired to has to do with walking. And that is my go-to. I always go back to how does the body have to put itself together in order for us to walk. That is where trying to turn my phone off here. Sound. There we go. This is a primary reflexive, innate, born with function that requires stability and mobility, and it's a survival mechanism. It's how we move around, and it's tricky because we're bipedal. We stand on 2 feet as opposed to 4 feet. And so this gives you the whole gait cycle, and there's more pictures as we get past our little summary here. And you're going to want to sort of have an idea of, okay, when I'm just getting ready to take a step, that's called heel strike initial content, tells you about how much joint movement you need, joint range, and it tells you the muscles, what the muscles are doing here. So when we first start, it's hip flexion, not much else right here. And then when we start to transfer the weight forward, the foot is in contact now, and then we start to move over top of that foot, then we start to see hip extensors are eccentric, they're getting longer, and the hip abductors are isometric. They're providing stability, and the quadriceps is eccentric, trying to control what's going on. So you can work your way through this, and the best way to understand this is to do it, take each step, and then stop and think about, okay, here's where the weight is, and now I'm shifting my weight forward. And our ergonomics is for massage begins as we are starting to move forward in our gait. It's like we stop halfway through the gait where the momentum is starting to bring our weight forward, and then we hold ourselves stable in that position. So in addition to that, the pelvic girdle, see, now this is why you got to know your bones and your joints. The pelvic girdle here and our shoulder girdle, where our limbs attach to the torso, this is where we get a counter swing. If the pelvis is going, translating to the left, then our shoulders are going to be translating to the right and vice versa. This movement in the transverse plane around the axis of the spine down through there allows us to transfer this weight back and forth while keeping our head forward. And a lot of our movement, walking, is on the sagittal plane, moving forward. So there's a lot of flexions and extensions. But this transverse plane movement at these girdles is going to allow us to shift the weight back and forth while holding our head forward. And there's a righting reflex where our eyes have to stay level with the horizontal plane. And if our head is tipped, and that's a strong signal right in through there, our whole body will shift to try to get those eyes level again. So the kinetic chain aspect of this is now how everything functions together. Nothing functions in isolation. And here are the components of that, and everything, if one part of it's messed up, the whole thing's messed up. So if the soft tissue structure, there's the lack of sliding, or the tone, muscle won't move easily from concentric to eccentric function. or if there's a joint, if the joint set of the two bones together is compromised, or it's not stable, it's too lax, or there's a problem with the nervous system, both sensing information and then bringing motor responses back, then the whole thing is messed up. So that's why it feels so complicated, and why there's not a simple explanation for why massage or other manual therapies can influence this in here. Do we primarily influence at the nervous system through a signaling response? Are we creating some pliability in the soft tissues around the joint so the joint set is good? Are we changing the actual consistency or altering the viscosity of the fascial unit so that there's less density there? It's a little of everything. You can't have one without the other. And then the other thing we have are the structure that is more focused on balance and stability. That's your inner unit. And this talks about inner unit, which are muscles that work just around a joint, and then your two jointed muscles, which are would be considered your outer unit. And then your muscles that are a little bit more related to movement. So this is another way of thinking about function. Are we looking more at smaller joint to joint function, inner unit, or are we looking at, you know, how the hip has to interact with the opposite shoulder, and how is that connected? And what are the physical units that do that? Does the lumbar dorsal fascia come into play with that, for example? So, and then we have these areas, which I talked about before, those lines I had drawn. These are transverse diaphragms, and that's where forces twist. And those are going to be your area that are most vulnerable. And so there's a real important balance between stability and mobility there. And then in order for the muscles to move effectively, you have to have a sequence. This one goes first, and then this one goes first, and this one goes first, and or goes after that. And in a closed kinematic chain, that's the whole chain. So, for example, if I'm going to take a step, I have to have some contraction of the gluteal group to stabilize, so that I can then use the hip flexors to bring that leg forward. You know, and these it feels like they happen simultaneously, but they don't. So there are some, we're going to look at some firing patterns and or muscle synergies, simple ones. There are a lot of them, but we're just going to look at some basic ones that can give you a good idea about how this activation sequence is working. On a more mechanical level, there's something called slings, and this kind of gives you an example of a full, how do we function as a full body movement? Again, nothing happens in isolation. So, for example, if there were some sort of lack of sliding anywhere in this chain, it's going to affect all the way up and all the way down. It's never just the spot. So if we got an idea of what these are, then we can start thinking broader than, okay, it's a muscle. It's a trigger point in a muscle. Well, it might be, but it's probably also something in a muscle above the jointed area and two muscles below it, and the connective tissue units in through there. And remember, with joints, we had force closure and form closure, and so there's a lack of integrity in a joint. This happens a lot at the sacroiliac joint. So muscles that would be more, and connective tissues that would be more about movement or posture, now have to provide joint stability. And you know what? It's too much sometimes. And I'm going to tell you, a good, thorough, full body massage that accesses the tissues, the soft tissues between the joints, with multiple loads, with the grain, across the grain, combined with joint movement, either passive or active, will sort most of it out. Now, that doesn't give us an excuse for not having to think this way. But this also because this also becomes a cross communication between other disciplines. So this is certainly an area of further study. Then the last part of this chapter is that we're going to work with some biomechanical assessment, which is going to review the other aspects of bones, joints, and muscles for individual joints. And this is going to be primarily what I'm going to focus on in the second video that goes with this. And so here we're going to review the general movement patterns. We've had this before. This is not brand new. And then we're going to get into an overview of each region. And so here's your head and neck region. And when you read through this, you know that you are starting to use all of your accumulated information from the previous chapters. So this is, if you're reading through this and you encounter something you don't understand or you don't remember, then what you're going to want to do is back up and go find it in previous chapters. Or you're going to want to do a search on Google or whatever. And or you're going to want to look at YouTube. Maybe you can find something here on there that can clarify some of these. This is all put together now into a narrative. And down it goes. And then there's an activity. And this activity is more than just learning how to do some muscle assessment and joint assessment. It is going to give you relationships through a whole movement pattern. And so I'm not going to expand on this much more because we've got a second video that's on this, but this is this whole area of this. And it's based on functional movement. So this is important. And then we'll have another body area and all the movements that go with it, and another body area and all the movements that go with it. And it really starts to consolidate all of your information. So this is a linchpin of understanding functional mobility, and then starting to look at how massage can interface with it. So this is going to take some time for you to go through this. And I suggest you take it segment at a time, and every time you're practicing a massage in that segment, you try to reproduce these movements and think about Okay, what else is involved, and make sure that you are trying to connect the dots and look at how one area affects another, and then also bringing in the idea of assessment with some simple muscle testing. We should be coming to the end of this now. Now, as far as questions related to the MBLEX exam, likely they won't go into real fine detail, but if you can understand this chapter and you've got the parts of it, you should be able to figure out a lot of the questions relate specifically to anatomy, physiology of the musculoskeletal system, biomechanics, and some of the scenario questions. Okay, so this pathological condition segment is set up just a tad different. Oops, we're still got a few of these to get out of here. Get down. Every one of these movements you're seeing should be coordinated into your massage. That would be your joint movement that you would use with every massage, which then becomes an assessment. So we'll come back to this upper, I did it again. I did it again. So here we go. Let's get it back down to where we want to be. And we want to be at the, okay, we did it again. All right. So quick review. What I was saying is that you're going to want to, all these pictures, you should incorporate the movement displayed in all of these pictures in every single massage. It becomes a assessment process. And then you can determine if the joint is hypermobile or hypermobile or working just fine. And always look for what's working well. Don't always be looking for what's wrong. Now, there's some ways of thinking about the pathology. Getting back to that so we can finish this video out. And you do need some shortcuts to kind of make some decisions with stuff. And one of those is the upper and lower cross syndrome. It gives you a general idea of what might be short and what might be inhibited, therefore is not functioning at its best capacity, and what the outcome might be for that. There's the lower cross syndrome and the upper cross syndrome. And there's been some controversy on how accurate this really is, and who knows. But this, if you're just looking at how clients display, this is pretty common. And so we're going to get into the idea of caves and hills here. And in general, the cave, those muscles are going to be, or those structures, connective tissue included in the joints, they're going to be shortened, compressed, dense, and the other side, the hill, is going to be under a tension load, elongated, and possibly inhibited. But it'll feel really taut. Over here, you've got the weak abdomen, core area, and then you've got an increased lordosis. If I were going to do massage, I would focus on trying to increase the applicability and normalize the tone in the cave and reduce the sense of symptom which that people are going to feel. This is where it's short, where it's long back here, but it feels taut, like a trampoline. And so help decrease the sensation back here. And then for a real reversal, people will feel better after that, but for a real reversal, this area would need some gentle stretching to open it up, to take the strain off of the heel, and this would need some exercise. So now we get cross-discipline here. This might be a place for a physical therapist or a well-rounded and highly educated personal trainer to help bring in the actual movements that will correct that. Now, we can suggest a few things. That's within our scope of practice. But if this is pathological and people are really having symptoms with this, then it's nice to have a multidisciplinary approach. So as we start to see changes in function, oh, here's the long, short picture. When we start to see that, we can divide this into stages of deterioration. And so where things start to fall apart is it more of the soft tissue? Is it the joint? Or is it the neural drive on stuff? And how can we use, again, shortcuts like this one comes out of osteopathy, STAR. Is it sensitive to touch and various depths of palpation? Is the tissue changed? Is it thick, dense, stiff? Are there differences from one side to the other? And has mobility been altered? Both with restricted or reduced mobility or hypermobility. And then this can be defined as stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. And in the idea of where can massage work kind of by itself, without necessarily thinking about referring. And it's the first degree or in the stage 1. We're very successful working in there. And as it approaches second degree stage 2, where people are starting to struggle a little bit. But certainly, as we get into stage 2 and stage 3 biomechanical dysfunction, it's a multidisciplinary approach. And that's okay. If we actually catch people at first degree, which just happens with daily living, and can keep that contained, then maybe it won't progress, or it won't progress as fast. So this segment in the textbook actually is showing you what we are going to do in the next video, and how we can bring multiple chapters and multiple content together. So that's where we are going to start with that. And then there will be another video that will be more of a demonstration video on some additional assessment protocols that are located at the end of this chapter that have to do with the kinetic chain and the, as we continue down through here, the muscle synergies or the firing patterns. And in chapter 11 in your fundamentals textbook, there are videos on these. So lot of information in this chapter to absorb. So it's okay. That's all right. And then we have our little case study here, this critical thinking scenario. Okay, so that is the general overview of the chapter. Lots of information to be practiced in here. These chapters that are more about application and less about parts become, can feel overwhelming. As I was going through, I was starting to feel overwhelmed. I'm going, oh my goodness, that's expecting a lot for an entry-level student to try to absorb all of that. And the answer is that you're not going to. Not right away. You may not even have, it's likely you won't have this all absorbed by your entry-level graduation. But these two textbooks carry you beyond entry-level as well. And this particular chapter is an example of that. And combined with the video support and the classroom learning, this will become a lot more clear. So we will end this now, and then the next video in the sequence will be how to use these two chapters in combination so that you can learn how the activities primarily, how the activities in this chapter 10 go back and forth with the joints and the muscles. So there we go.